I'm Michael Berdash from the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to what is both the keynote address of the 33rd annual meeting of the Association for Japanese Literary Studies and the 19th Tetsuo Najita Distinguished Lecture in Japanese Studies. A few business items to mention. At the conclusion of tonight's lecture, there will not be a Q&A. We will move immediately to dinner, which will be served right outside those doors. Everyone is welcome to join us for dinner afterwards, and hopefully we can continue the conversation at that time in a more informal way. I also absolutely need to thank the staff from the Center for East Asian Studies, Abby Newman, Connie Yip, Myra Sue, Hyunjin Schubert, and their various assistants for really Herculean efforts in putting together this very, very complicated event. In 2017, I unexpectedly received an email from the Dean of the Humanities telling me that I was being appointed the Robert S. Ingersoll Professor in Japanese Studies. And when you're appointed to one of these things, you do two things. The first thing is you look up the name of the person who's after, you Google them, and you're going, while you're Googling them, you're thinking, please don't be a war criminal, please don't be a war criminal. And in this case, not so bad, actually, as these things go. Then the second thing you do is you look up who held this chair before you. And when I did that, I learned that the two previous holders of this chair were Tetsuo Najita and Norma Field. And I can't tell you how honored and happy I was to realize that I was following those two. And tonight, I get to introduce Norma Field, giving the Tetsuo Najita Distinguished Lecture in Japanese Studies. And so it gives me a chance to tell you a little bit about both of those figures. This is the 19th lecture in a series that began in 2007 to honor the legacy of the late Tetsuo Najita, who joined the faculty of the University of Chicago in 1969 and retired in 2002. In his 30-plus years on our faculty, he published many books, including Visions of Virtue in Tokugawa, Japan in 1987, and Ordinary Economies in Japan in 2009. His brilliant scholarship was recognized with many distinguished honors, including a Guggenheim Fellowship and appointment to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In addition to his scholarship, Tetsuo Najita was a remarkable teacher and mentor to many scholars who went on to distinguished careers on their own, and he was also a brilliant administrator and fundraiser. And one of the reasons we're able to do things like this is thanks to the work that Tetsuo Najita did about 50 years ago. In the 1970s and 80s and 90s, he and his colleagues created really a legendary program in Japanese studies here at the University of Chicago that came to be known nationally and internationally by both its fans and its detractors as the Chicago School. And it's a legacy that we're very proud of. Our speaker tonight is one of the colleagues who built that program together with Tetsuo Najita. Norma Field is the Robert S. Ingersoll Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus in East Asian Languages and Civilizations. She earned her PhD from Princeton University. She came to the University of Chicago in 1983 and was the first female tenure-track appointment in my department, East Asian Languages and Civilizations. She earned many honors across her career, including a Guggenheim Fellowship. She had many distinguished publications, including The Splendor of Longing in the Tale of Genji from 1987. That's the book where I first encountered Norma's work and first fell in love with both her mind and her writing style. She then published two remarkable books that combine memoir, ethnography, social history, commentary. The first was In the Realm of the Dying Emperor, A Portrait of Japan at Century's End, which came out in 1993. It won an American Book Award and was featured on the cover of the New York Times Book Review. And then in 1997, From My Grandmother's Bedside, Sketches of Post-War Tokyo. Those two titles in particular for me really stand as a model for what committed ethical scholarship should look like. And then finally, I have to mention For Dignity, Justice, and Revolution, an anthology of Japanese proletarian literature that Norma co-edited with Heather Borenstruck, that came out in 2015, a long overdue comprehensive introduction in English of Japan's proletarian literature movement. It will, as we all know, remain the standard work on this for many decades to come. Norma has long had an interest in questions of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and in particular the role that the University of Chicago played in that history. So she had this interest, and then 3/11 and Fukushima came along. And I think for Norma that really changed everything, and I think we're going to hear about that in her talk tonight. When Norma retired in 2012, we organized a conference to honor all that she had contributed to the University of Chicago. And at Norma's request, we scheduled it on the first anniversary of the 3/11 disaster. And we asked the invited guests that came to the conference to speak on one topic, which was, what does 3/11 mean to me? Norma gave us a list of possible speakers to invite, and it was a remarkable list. This was like a list of who's in Japan, public intellectuals and activists that we wanted to invite to the conference. And not only did we want to invite these people from Japan, but we wanted to invite them on the first anniversary of 3/11, when they all would have been in huge demand for media specials and that sort of thing in Japan. It was people like the literary scholar Komori Yoichi, the philosopher Takahashi Tetsuya, the activist and author Amamiya Kadian, and others. And I was so terrified we weren't going to get any of these people. That they would all just be too busy. But when we contacted them, they all said pretty much exactly the same thing. If it's for Norma, I'll do it. And that's how we all feel here. If it's for Norma, we'll do it. And so I'm so happy and delighted that she accepted our invitation to speak tonight. It's an honor and a pleasure to introduce Norma Field for this year's Tetsuo Najita Distinguished Lecture in Japanese Studies.
My goodness, that's so humbling. And I have to think about, what have I done with all the gifts and support and the help, knowledge given me? I hope to share some of that today. Still working on this book, but thank you so much, Mike, and all the rest of you for having asked me to give this speech tonight, the AJLS, as well as the Najita lecture. I wanted to say a word about the Japan Studies, the Chicago School. When I came here, the end of 1983, it was already a thing, right? So I didn't know what it was like to be here before it was a thing. And I have to think about how Tets came here a bit earlier than the others. And what kind of effort does it take to make a thing out of a minority field? Not so minor in terms of political science, history, modernization studies, for example, but in a different way to tackle this country. And so I think about what imagination it took for Tets, and probably a dose of foolhardiness, and mountain loads of work, and most certainly friendship, when he was joined by Harry Hartunian and Bernie Silberman, and then Bill Sibley, an intense, volatile, and necessary friendship. So I'm thinking of them all tonight as I stand before you. And now I have to drink some ginger tea because I took Sudafed this afternoon. You can't buy it in the US anymore, but I seem to have squirreled some away and my mouth is really dry, so forgive me. But I don't have any to spare, any Sudafed to spare, in case you were hoping. Okay, and then AJLS, I remember going to one of the early ones when it was still called the Midwest Japanese Literary Studies Association. Maybe it was at Bloomington. To call it Midwest meant that back in those days, pretty much it was people who could drive to get there. And there was something wonderfully cozy and a cozy legitimation of spending all this time talking about literary works, as it was then. It was already quaint to talk about literature. Early 1990s in the Academy. It was practically quaint here at the University of Chicago, I found, coming from backward Princeton, of sorts. But I am impressed and gratified to see how literature has been construed in its most capacious way. And because as you know, I actually brought a furoshiki with me, but I left it in my backpack. I got this furoshiki notion from my mentor, Mitani Kuniaki, whom I know Tom Lamar here knew. I wanted to share a story with you because I wouldn't otherwise have a chance. And he who thought you needed to know everything to mobilize all your knowledge, and knowledge would have to be construed to include emotion as well, to interpret a work of literature, he from whom I got this furoshiki notion, he was a man who seemed to know everything. I suspect it would be called zatsugaku in Japanese, just a master of zatsugaku. Trivia, I was horrified to see that as the first English translation to come up. Zatsugaku is it's got much more dignity than that. But anyway, I remember I asked him once, how do you remember everything that you know? And he paused, I think actually embarrassed. I never saw him embarrassed otherwise. And he muttered under his breath, Hegel. And okay, so you who have this ever-changing furoshiki of knowledge, you've got Hegel in there to help you kind of introduce order that you can undo when you need to. But it would lead to questions like this. He typically began a class on the tale of Genji by asking the class, what do you know about this story from the title? What do you know about, does anyone in the audience know what the answer is? Just take a big guess. No shame. All right. The answer is, we know that this is going to be a story about a guy who can't become emperor, right? What a world that opens up, right? It brings us all the pathways that we think of as comprising that capacious genre called the novel, from alienation to conquest and back, right? In this, it's capacious and capricious, and it keeps being useful for us, even if we don't literally mean words printed between two covers anymore. So think of how those explorations contained in a piece of fabric that could be untied and retied, but contain nonetheless, at any given moment, that it could, that container made possible taking on questions of form and content and context, word and world, in shifting relation, but always in relation. So it's great good fortune for us to have this time together tonight. I think we're all aware that we're living through times of horrendous tawdriness and tragedy and terror. And so it can make those of us who are not immediately exposed to risk want to become indifferent because most of us who are in that position are always having to be aware somewhere in some part of ourselves that we probably should and could do more. So we live with that discomfort, which I think we have to embrace as important, and at the same time, we try to make the most of these moments that are given to us to think together about what history and the present can continue to give us that maybe will allow us to better address the moment. So with that, what I'd like to do is share with you, really all I'm doing tonight is sharing with you my collection of images and words that I've been gathering since knowing that I would have to tackle Fukushima, that I've been gathering since the beginning, which is to say one kind of beginning, the beginning of the Fukushima nuclear disaster. That's by no means the beginning even of that disaster, for almost 15 years. And so, Chapter 1, Faces. Yeah, I wanted us to look at them all together at first, and then we'll take them up individually. The first two the first two photographs, I've known since 2019 when they were taken. I hadn't looked at them in a while until 2 days ago or so, and they hit me even harder than when I first saw them. Why is that? Is it because we're living through traumatic times that I feel readier to face up to the depths of those expressions of grief? I don't know. I think I'd be interested to know how you're responding to them. The bottom two, the only male one I've known about for a while, I was cavalier. This is 2011, April, so not long after March 11th. When I first saw it, I was cavalier. I thought, you're that Tokyo University expert, now a bureaucrat, and you deserve what you're getting, although I was glad for the occasion. Now I see how callow and callous and utterly inadequate that response was. So I'm glad to have a chance to revisit it with you. The last photo is not Fukushima related. It comes from Nagasaki, and it's a 1970 photograph, but I hadn't seen it till last month. Yeah, almost last month. At the Peace Resource Center, a stupendous exhibit of Barbara Reynolds' Peace Resource collection at Wilmington College, where one of our history PhDs is the director. And it's a face that hasn't let go of me since. So even though it's not even for purposes of my argument the most convenient A-bomb victim's face to show, I still wanted it. As this experience of taking the time to look at faces in grief, taking some time to do that. And now I want to tell you a bit about each of them. Libby Halevi she grew up, I think, in Evanston-like territory, lives in California. She was an accidental hibakusha from 3 Mile Island in 1979. It was clearly a traumatic experience for her. And what she decided to do was to leave and forget about it. And forget about it, put it aside, however consciously she put it aside, forgot about it. It was obviously dwelling inside her. And that lasted over 30 years until the Fukushima disaster took place. And then she decided to dedicate her life to it. She became a student of all things nuclear. And even as an utter beginner, she started hosting a podcast called Nuclear Hot Seat, which is what she's continued to do it. So next spring will be almost 14 years. One show a week, sometimes repeats, but it's a great place to educate yourself on nuclear matters all over the world. What Libby was thinking in that grief, was it, I don't know, was it the grief of coming on the 40th anniversary of 3 Mile Island? I was there too. This is not a photo I took. And a professional photographer took it, and she said to me, that is the truest photograph of me that's ever been taken, and gave me permission to use it, and my Japanese activist friends to use it. Perhaps feeling the weight of what she had repressed for 30-some years and what that meant I should also add and tell you that, that one of the things that stunned me was that there were they become part of a very fine documentary called The Women of 3 Mile Island, women who had become activists then, who were not politically inclined at all and were not critics of nuclear power. But when she learned that some of us were from Japan, one of them said, "We felt so terrible. We held our candles," because people gather at 4 something whenever the meltdown took place every year with candles. He said, that year we held our candles and wept. And I thought, if only we had worked harder, this wouldn't be happening to the women of Fukushima now. That's quite a way to respond to that, isn't it? Okay, that's Libby. This is Uno Saeko. She left very early because she had already joined the anti-nuclear movement in Fukushima when this happened. She had a young daughter, academic husband. They left very decisively. It's very hard to leave, as you can imagine, and went from Fukushima to Kyoto. She is a strong activist leader. She hosts one of my major sites of study, once a month webinar. This grief that Sai-chan, as she's known, was showing then, it's on the occasion of the first decision on the only criminal trial that's ever taken place. On September 19th, 2019, Tokyo District Court, it was an extraordinary reading of the decision, because those of us who were lucky enough to be inside the courtroom, therefore I was not outside where she was, were imprisoned there while the chief judge speed read this decision that seemed so inadequate to everyone concerned. And what Uno Saeko, what her grief must have been, could only speculate. For doing these trials are social movements. There's so many people who have to be committed to them to have these happen. They were called shinajo at one point, 3 women from Shinagawa-ku who did a lot of the setup, right? You get your police permit, and then you make sure that the passers-by will be able to get through in the area outside the courthouse. There are people who are in charge of the vertical banners and the horizontal banners, all of this stuff which seems tedious, mechanical, and yet that is how you express to yourself and for each other the meaning of engaging this activity to take the 3 top executives of TEPCO, whom the prosecutors had refused to prosecute, though they extensively researched it. And then after 2 equivalents of grand juries in the US said these 3 were appropriate for indictment, this criminal trial finally unfolded. So I think it's the sense of that defeat, of that effort not being encouraged. It's also that Uno Saeko, Muto Ruiko, whom some of you know, have heard also, the way they worded their statements were serious in the utmost sense. That is to say, they were really aiming high, saying this, to seek justice is to be scrutinized ourselves. We must scrutinize ourselves. But what this trial is for the recovery of the dignity of every single person injured and now wandering in the depths of despair. So there was never legal language or even political language so much, but the sense of how this technology so carelessly wielded has hurt human beings to the core. And to have that cavalierly dismissed, I think, is part of the grief she's showing us. Okay, Kosako Toshiso had recently joined Kan Naoto's cabinet as a special advisor because of his expertise and measuring radiation and exposure. And I think he was also asked to join because he had been a reliable specialist for the government in the trials of Hiroshima and Nagasaki A-bomb victims who were seeking compensation. People, the many hibakusha of Hiroshima and Nagasaki who had been kept outside the circle of support. And he had always been very reliable in maintaining the government position, which I will also quickly tell you in case you don't know, is the US position, which is the ABCC position of these institutions set up in Hiroshima and Nagasaki shortly after the war, and the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, which is the Japanese-US bilateral, that these people could not possibly have received a severe enough dosage to argue that their illnesses qualified them for support. So Mr. Kosako, Dr. Kosako was a reliable person for the government. And then this is a press conference he calls in 29th of April. That's when the Education Ministry said, we can open all schools. In other words, school grounds would be open for use, elementary school kids, middle school kids, compulsory education, as long as they measured under 20 millisieverts per hour. I'm not going to get into units of radiation, but 20 millisieverts per hour is this not complicated. It's a contradictory unit because it's also the unit that the government used to justify or order mandatory evacuation. And since then it also became the unit, as long as it's under 20 millisieverts an hour, people can move back into lands that have been closed off. And for Mr. Kosako, I mean, it also is what the international standard, and the Japanese government follows it, for radiation, for nuclear workers, it's the rule of thumb, don't be exposed to more than 20 millisieverts an hour. And that was the last straw for him. He had apparently okayed this incredible loosening of standards for food contamination. So both the government and other experts in Fukushima, I think, felt he was a traitor, but he had this press conference and said, he criticized a number of things the government had done, withholding information from the computerized program, for instance. But he also said it was this allowing children to go back to school at the same rate of exposure as nuclear workers is something I cannot accept either as a human being or as a scientist. And he wept at that, and he left. The Education Ministry promptly did reopen schools. I mean, it was an easy decision for the Education Ministry because if you set the standard high enough, like 20 millisieverts, there were practically no schools that you had to keep closed. So you didn't have to worry about where to send kids who might have lost a school, right? One of the things you learn about the Fukushima disaster is that they kept moving the contaminated stuff all over the country, which is a basic no-no for people involved. You try to keep contaminated things together in one place. So they sent the contaminated stuff all over the archipelago, pretty much, and tried to keep people locked in place to the extent possible. So I wonder about his grief and whether it was, I mean, surely having a child, he said, I can't imagine allowing my own child to be exposed to that. That would make it pretty immediate. But I'm wondering now if also there was the weight of all the times he had stood in the way of hibakusha from Hiroshima and Nagasaki because they weren't exposed enough, locked into that moment of grief. And I'm really glad. How many male bureaucrats would be willing to do that at a press conference, right? Good for you. All right. This is about Fukuda Sumako, who became a poet after her experience of being bombed in Nagasaki. Her father and two sisters were killed instantly, And then she had a life of poverty and illness. After that, she will die only 2 years after this photograph was taken. There are a couple of things about, I don't know, when I first saw this photograph, without knowing anything, I looked at it and I said, I can't tell if that's a man or a woman. It's as if this person had transcended that. And then I read about her, and you don't get people with disfigurations like this pretty much from nuclear accidents. So that is distinctive of the A-bomb, but there are also, please remember, so many, probably more Hiroshima and Nagasaki hibakusha who show no physical marks of having been afflicted. Just as Mr. Tanaka, who visited Chicago a couple of weeks ago, was of that kind. And I also want to say that those people who were exposed to so-called low dose or entered the next day or the day after looking for relatives, often their diseases will be delayed. So the hibakusha from Hiroshima who visited Chicago, DePaul, and a bunch of schools here in Chicago, said that it was in his 50s that he proceeded to develop one cancer after another, 6 of them, right? And that makes it easier to deny people like that a likely causal relationship between having been exposed to the bombs and their illnesses. But Fukuda Sumako, this photographer who seems to have been part of a proletarian-like photographers association in post-war Japan, wanted to really take a picture of her and said she never went out without her wig. And he said to her, Suma-chan, let me take a picture of the real you without your chapeau, he said. Whether chapeau was a euphemism for wigs that he charmingly came up with, or whether it was commonly used in that sense, she did accede. And then while taking this picture of her, he noticed that she had tears in her eyes. And she said, but after all, you know I'm a woman. And the photographer said after that, he was reluctant to take any more pictures of hibakusha. All right. Now, this actually is the image that made me want to focus on images for this presentation to you. This section I've titled Faces, and this is the photograph where we have headless torsos. The context is, these are 2 dads, and they were referred to or addressed by the press as the person in black and the person in white. And they were speaking from Fukushima, and these are the press gathered in a room in Tokyo for the 311 Thyroid Cancer Family Association launch. That's 2016. Thyroid cancer is known to be closely related to radiation exposure. You can, in fact, go to a National Institutes of Health or National Cancer Institute site in the US and look up the likelihood, if you were born in the US before 1965, of your having thyroid cancer. It's that established, even though they drag their feet on it. And pediatric thyroid cancer is the only cancer that the international nuclear authorities acknowledged a causal relationship with Chernobyl exposure. It took 10 years for that to happen. Japanese government seems bent on taking this one back, this surrender for the international community, because they are fighting this. I mean, it's actually TEPCO that young people exposed at the time in Hiroshima and Fukushima have taken to suit, but to court. And these fathers' voices were altered. I think of it as a grotesquerie that's completely, efficiently symbolic of so many of the wrongs with how Fukushima has been handled. Why is it that they have to hide their identities as if they had been criminally engaged in criminal acts? Why is it that they are so, why do they have to protect their identities? Did I mention their voices were altered too? Not only can we not see them, but their voices are altered. That they have to, in order to protect their own and their families' safety, mostly from harassment, that they have to take this kind of form in order to take questions from the press. Watching this video, it's still online, is really interesting. It's billed as a coming out. So I was so stunned to see the person in black and the person in white, where they're really expressive with, well, what can they express themselves with, is their hands. Is that you can watch, you can get a sense of the tension they're feeling with what their hands are doing on their knees, right? And you can picture yourself doing that. They're very reluctant to say anything. Some of the press try to say, well, do you think there's a relation between your child's thyroid cancer and the TEPCO accident? And they say, well, that is something we don't know, can't address that. So it's grotesque, and it's a grotesque manifestation of courage. It's two dads they've got to appear in this way, right? So I think it's extraordinary. It's extraordinarily, it's disturbing in this quiet, constrained way that things work out here, and really revealing. And things are hardly better now. What? 9 years. Next year it'll be 10 years later. Okay. Hanford. The B reactor at Hanford, this grim-looking building on the right, in 2023, there's an extraordinary oratorio. It's called an oratorio that was performed there. And in the back, you see the B reactor, the tubes that held the uranium that would produce the plutonium that provided both the bombs for Trinity and Nagasaki. So Hanford has a very special relationship to Japan. Yuki Miyamoto and I felt very fortunate to guide a Nagasaki hibakusha to this site, 2017, 2018. We were both nervous about going into the B reactor. Department of Energy, we didn't think, was really committed to telling us the truth about how clean the place was. And there were previous Japanese visitors we know who had taken simple Geiger counters in. So we knew that it wasn't clean. But at the same time, this hibakusha, whose life had been so altered by what was produced here, really wanted to go. So we all got into Tyvek suits and really made a spectacle of ourselves. But afterwards, in a press conference, PBS reporter asked him, why did you suit up? And he just, without hesitation, he said to her, why didn't you? Right? Because there is no allowance for manifesting danger in that site. The vibe of Richland, right? It was named very deliberately, the town closest, the most wealthy of the three towns outside Hanford site. It's a very hard place. The school, the logo, you may know, is the mushroom cloud, and the sports teams are called the Bombers. And the whole town's identity hangs on being the place that ended World War II. All right, so I don't really have time to go into this, but it's an extraordinary piece of music. Look up Nuclear Dreams Hanford, and you can listen to it. The words are pretty amazing, many of them. This one is somewhat hopeful in the sense of being brave. It tells an I who was trapped in a tank, and then the I was sung by a mezzo-soprano, so I'll say, she says, if everyone who's ever seen Hanford is willing to take out a teaspoonful of waste, because these are high-level waste tanks that have been leaking for a long time, and really there is nothing that seems to work, even vitrification, turning the stuff into glass. But one of the things I learned from Hanford, which really helps me understand Fukushima, is to have a project that cannot be successfully completed, in which so much national investment has made place, like the development of nuclear weapons, and the Pacific National Northwest Labs, the equivalent of our Argonne and Fermi. If you have an impossible project, you're never going to run out of money. There's always budget to be provided for this endless tax. So think of this character. The librettist herself had worked as an environmental scientist measuring stuff at Hanford for 30 years. So she's writing in part from her own experience and what her coworkers. But I was really interested in because tanks are a big deal at Fukushima too, and this whole, the imagery of taking into your own body the poison by which you are surrounded. Nuclear workers. Koide Hiroaki, some of you have seen and heard him and know about him, our big academic hero in Japan, Kyoto University, part of that early generation of physicists, students, early 1970s, late 80s, early 80s, who took very, very seriously the scientist's duty to society. What responsibility do we have to the society we're living in? And so they studied up, they shared their expertise with activist groups and citizens. So Koide is part of that. And Koide was saying in an interview, ordinarily workers sell their labor power and gain wages in return. In the case of nuclear power, what workers are selling is exposure dose. And in this book I put here, those of you who read Japanese, I hope it might someday come out in English. It is the book about nuclear labor for Fukushima. It is incredible because she essentially lived there, got the trust of these workers. It's hard to be a nuclear power plant worker, even if you're not a TEPCO employee, which is another whole can of worms. But it's not something your son might be proud of what you're doing, but you also don't want them to be tainted by the nuclear reputation, legacy, possibility of contamination. So going home for vacations, that's a whole thing. But the other thing is managing your dose, right? You need the wages, but if you run out, if you've hit your limit, before the fiscal year, then you're not going to get paid towards the end, and you really can't feel secure until you get your limit for the following fiscal year. It's a very odd way to think about your exposure and contamination, but that's what it is. The other thing I learned, well, let's go to the next one. This is didactic. This is my didactic slide, okay? This is something my friend and colleague Yuki Miyamoto, who herself is a second-generation Hiroshima hibakusha, I like to say, hibakusha, an A-bomb person or people, are also hibakusha, radiation-exposed person or people. And if you write it out in Japanese, the first one, baku, is the baku for bakudan, explosive but almost entirely used for A-bombs. Hibakusha are also hibakusha, right, is how it would read. And so for many of us who want to put an end to the propaganda that there are atoms for war and atoms for peace, one of the things we try to do it is in how we write the word hibakusha in Japanese. We use hiragana in the middle to say this could be a bomb person, or it could be someone from a nuclear power plant accident or living around. Here's the other thing. Yuki and I also say all hibakusha, A-bomb people, are also hibakusha, exposed people, because think of this. If you survive the blast, what are you going to be eating the following days, right? You're going to be eating plants that have been watered by rain that was contaminated, that has seeped into the soil. You are ingesting radionuclides in your body. You are absolutely the second kind of hibakusha. This is the bit of knowledge that the US government absolutely tried to clamp down on immediately after, like no residual radiation. It's the refusal. Well, it's hard to study internal radiation, but that we now have tools for it. The Radiation Effects Research Foundation is a very good documentary from 2012 where the head goes to Fukushima and says, sorry guys, what we've studied for, what? Since 1950, for 62 years, we can't really help you because we only studied external exposure. Exposure where the source of the radiation is outside, like an X-ray, goes through your body. If you turn the X-ray machine off, you're no longer exposed. Take alpha, beta particles inside you. It's almost like having a nuclear reactor inside you, right? And they choose the organs they're cozy in, and they're constantly bombarding. And only when you can get rid of them from your body or they finish their biological half-life, are you free of that internalized. No wonder experts never want to address this. And the thing I wanted to say was, having shown you that book about labor, Fukushima workers, is that this author recently went to the International Radiation Victims Forum that was held in Hiroshima, people all over the world, because we have them all over the world. And she reported on workers. Workers, nuclear power plant workers, are not ordinarily called hibakusha. They're called sagyoin workers because Japanese are anxious around the word laborer too, right? Rodosha. Koide Hiroyuki always says rodosha, but everyone else says sagyoin, a worker, Can't tell a difference if they're white collar, blue collar, or what. They get dosage, but we never ever call them hibakusha. Why is that? Is it because hibakusha, the very sound of the word, I think, is so scary, it's intolerable. And it would be intolerable, I think, to think that there are thousands and thousands of people who are employed to be hibakusha, right? So better cordon them off as sagyoin who work with radiation. That's that bit. Always like to bring this up at the University of Chicago. A key thing that many people are realizing is that you can't be a nuclear weapons holder without bombing and exposing your own citizens, right? It makes no sense to spend so much money developing these weapons and not being able to test them to see how they work. The other side of that, and inseparably so, is the fact that you say, but we have to know what happens if the enemy tries to drop one of these. And that's why so many human radiation experiments were conducted during the Cold War. University of Chicago was involved in a bunch of them, like a few other institutions. It's the only institution I know of so far that used its own students and staff as guinea pigs. And this is in a congressional report. You can look it up on American Nuclear Guinea Pigs, headed by then Congressman Ed Markey, now senator from Massachusetts. What I found interesting, it was 102 students and staff, 1961 to 64. They were fed Nevada test site fallout, right? Talk about ingesting radionuclides, or simulated fallout to see how long it would take for it to leave their bodies. But I think they were only monitored 2 weeks. And some of these strontium, cesium-130, these will stay around for much longer than 2 weeks. Not positive about the 2 weeks, but it's not very long. But what interested me this time was to look at the original report. 3 University of Chicago faculty at the end of their article in Health Physics, 1966, say they are especially grateful to the 102 volunteers who hoped they were making a contribution to civil defense. I think they hoped they were grateful. I can't imagine that they were interviewing these people. But in any case, this is also part of our history. And for a different kind of human guinea pig, this is something I just encountered in February this year. As you know or can guess, the Japanese government was very conservative, to say, use a huge euphemism, in reporting on findings on measurements. They also pretty much refused to do soil sampling. Very limited soil sampling. So it's air dosage, often from airplanes above. How that's going to be helpful to kids on the ground, everyone, yes, you are necessarily skeptical. But there were these faithful civil servants. This one was somebody with 40 years of experience. He was then working for the Ministry of Education. What else is it? Culture, sports, technology, all of that now. And he kept going on his assignments to measure during that time. And he came across fantastic measurements, the highest. This one is only 95. It's hard to see. This was a scrap of paper at a kind of a godforsaken intersection. And it's very moving. I mistakenly tried to straighten it out in the thought that you might be able to see the second entry for March 16th. 95.1 millisieverts, which is 800 times the normal amount, right? 800 times. But he had also measured 322 in another town. And when he reported that, they said, oh, you must have miscalculated. But what really caught my attention was how Mr. Watanabe Makio and his colleague, who remains unnamed, said, by our not wearing masks, we can get data on internal exposure. Well, you can call this human subject experimentation. We thought that being the ones doing the measuring, we ought to become the specimens, right? So there are a number of people, we have accounts of people seeing men in white running around saying, what are you doing here? Get out of here. And wondering why, or people in City Hall, Date City Hall, wearing protective gear, and why, citizens knew nothing about wearing protective gear. These two very consciously did not wear protective gear, but as they drove around taking the measurements, they always got out of the car if they saw anyone, and they felt that by not wearing protective gear, they would seem more accessible and perhaps trustworthy, whatever, and talk to whoever was hanging out where they shouldn't be anymore, that they should leave. Okay. Okay, I should hurry up. On the left-hand side, okay, here's another factoid that really stunned me, because everyone thinks Germany has been so great freeing itself, mostly of nuclear power. But Japan has stopped many, many more nuclear power reactors, sightings, than Germany, in fact. Twice as many, according to one account, of nuclear power plants were not cited because of citizen activism as have been cited. And mostly, you were more successful if you were able to do that before the first shovel was struck in the ground, right? It makes complete sense. But to engage in this kind of struggle, in some cases, even without a trial, it's 40 years before it's resolved. Think of living 40 years with neighbors that you're at odds with. You know, think of all the awkwardness, if not outright hostility, if a community has decided that the ticket to economic stability is housing this plant, which everyone says is necessary and safe, right? So to engage in these communal struggles is an extraordinary undertaking. If it's taken 40 years and you've been involved from the beginning, it's really your adult lifetime. So this one is Onagawa Genpatsu on the left in Miyagi Prefecture, which is Sendai. And I hope you can see the riot police. in the back there. And there in the back. They're all there with their shields and helmets to protect themselves against, okay, the fishery cooperative is divided. How painful is that? How painful is it for fisher folk to sell their fishing rights, to give in and sell their fishing rights, right? There can't be righteous like the fishing folk who refuse to do that. But how painful is it to give up the sea, which is the place where you have made your life, that has supported your whole life and your grandfather's life, to sell that out, right? So these were heated. And the point of my slide is, this is no longer necessary. And why? Because I suppose this accident, this disaster happened, so it's not a question of preventing something. It is a question of preventing revolt by the citizenry, demanding answers and demanding to be taken care of. And the key player there is the big PR firm Dentsu. Dentsu got so much money from the Environment Ministry, which seems to be dedicated to imposing acceptance of nuclear reactor presence on the citizenry. But Dentsu, because they have such smart and so many staff, they can do everything. They can write articles for elementary school newspapers, middle school papers, high school papers, and make them look like news articles, right? And teach young kids, no, there's nothing to worry about with this. Dentsu can hire Tokyo, this rock pop band, and they can make it all fun. You know, Tokyo just really took over Fukushima Prefecture. They disbanded this June because of another scandal, but that's a separate story. What Dentsu did, and they would also be monitoring people's internet presence in the stormy days before the Olympics, right? It was, oh, this person is making a negative comment. In other words, they had become a surveillance entity, right? So in a way, I think of Dentsu as a kind of shadow state. And they're so effective because they never, ever need to call in the riot police, for instance. People, I want to say it's compulsory happiness. You know those jobs that a lot of people want, like to travel all over Japan, going to the best hot springs and having the incredible dinner, and you take one bite and then you make these smacking sounds and sighs about how good that was. Well, Dentsu is expert at that. All of the food produced in Fukushima, it is so delicious, as I'm sure you can tell. But Dentsu isn't alone. In fact, everybody is learning to be Dentsu, including the conventional media. I don't have time, I'm running out, so I have words that I've collected, and the top one is my favorite, said by a young woman, early 40s, and she said, I worry that my husband worries about my worrying. I worry that he stopped worrying. So, you know, she's worried her husband worries about her psychic frailty, and, you know, living in Fukushima is stressful. At the same time, she's worried if he has stopped worrying so that he's cool with living in Fukushima. And I think that kind of tension within families, within very close spouses even, put that together with the headless torsos of the dad, and that's also another condensed image of what the management of Fukushima is like. I'll just say quickly, this is what 16-year-old boy said in front of Pope Francis, and I think these words are really important, saying we're the ones who are going to have to live with this contaminated environment. I think grown-ups have a responsibility to tell us about the contamination and exposure and all the harms that could come along without hiding a thing. I don't want them to die on us, leaving behind their lies, not admitting to anything. Pretty honest words. And maybe only a 16-year-old could have spoken those words in front of Pope Francis. But here's also this that pray with us that we may perceive each other's pain and become able to love each other again. That however cruel the reality, we be given the courage not to avert our eyes. That courage be granted the powerful so they can acknowledge their errors and repent. I think these words don't lose their meaning just because most people haven't arisen to the demand. I think they're still shining words for us to hang on to. Actually, the author of the next words is sitting here. I thought a lot about whether to close with this. I have one image in this, and I'll be done, and we can eat. Clara Takarabe tells us that the West Eastern Divan is an orchestra that was dreamed up by Daniel Barenboim and Edward Said in 1999 to address all the tensions that were already ongoing there. The idea that if you have young musicians, Arabs from all over and Jews from Israel and the US, and you have them form an orchestra together, that would be a way to intervene in the situation. This is a very small part of my favorite piece of writing ever about music. And I wondered if it was disrespectful either to the participants in the West East Divan or the people in Fukushima to bring an example from so far away. But to me, these were the words and the thoughts in them were the only ones that hit at an appropriate register for what's going on in Fukushima. And this is Clara having thought about, okay, you have an orchestra, how's that going to bring about peace? And the hypocrisy, the conditions of what Palestinian musician is going to have the skills to audition at that level, et cetera, et cetera. So having rehearsed all the proper skepticism, she says, this is where I find the absolute genius. Fear, anger, grief, all these emotions and bodily states are stored in the same place from which we express and experience music. Okay, here's the thing. It is not possible to find the greatest good for all from a place of existential grief and fear, but neither is it possible while repressing the powerful urges of grief and fear. Expression, full expression, does not just lead to mental and bodily health, but full expression of desires and emotions are one part of possessing human dignity. So I think people in Fukushima, both the ones who will absolutely not complain because expressing anxiety has been weaponized, has been criminalized, right? Because you're standing in the obstruction of reconstruction and recovery, and those who are still cannot, who admit their worries to themselves and maybe few trusted friends, but also act on them. It's not the same as performing music together, but that division has stifled everyone from feeling, right? Because it's too burdensome to feel the fear and grief. No parent is going to stop worrying about whether they did the right or wrong thing by not evacuating their child. No parent can forget that. So even if you're all for, rah reconstruction, you're still living with that. So the people of Fukushima have been, they've been prevented from feeling, knowing, and thinking. And there's a compulsory program of happiness and cheerfulness as led, for example, by Dentsu, but it's happened other times from other sources in Japanese society. And without facing up to that grief, acknowledging it in each other and supporting each other, I think it's hard to take a next step. But I wanted to leave you with this image. 5 years after the Headless Torso press conference, this is a march to the courthouse. Marches to the courthouse, so many Fukushima trials have this. It's very thrilling. It's a very short thing. It's from Kasumigaseki subway station to Tokyo District Court, but you have the banner. The lead lawyers are often in the front, other supporters. And this declaration that, yes, we are going to court, and we are taking you, TEPCO in this case, to court. It's really something. And what I want to tell you about, because it's so hard to see, and I took this from a video, it's very subtle because everyone's still wearing masks, but the short woman in the middle is the mother of a plaintiff. And when she hears applause come from the sidewalk, people on the sidewalk, as they walk along, she looks towards them. You know, we used to talk about smiles, was it? Smiles above a mask, smiling eyes, right? She pauses, looks in the direction of the people applauding her, and you know she's smiling. And later at the press conference, she says, I am proud of my son for being part of this lawsuit. So this is not exactly a reconciliation of the kind that I would love to see in Fukushima and elsewhere, but it's also an admission of what you are worthy of as a human being and your child is worthy of, and having that publicly acknowledged, however restricted the means. So thank you so much. You're all so tired and hungry. Appreciate your listening to me.